Hey, what's up guys? Jake Verdon Tech here, back with another video, and today we're going to be jumping into a little retro gaming project. In the past, you guys may have seen me doing some retro gaming on Raspberry Pis and other PCs. Today we're actually going to try and run one inside of a virtual machine. So we're going to quickly go over the setup and what a virtual machine is. So for the setup, we have my daily driver gaming and editing rig that's water cooled. You guys are probably pretty familiar with this system for those of you that are subscribed to the channel. But going over it real quick, we have a i7 8700K, a GTX 1080 Ti, 32 gigs of RAM, and we got a couple terabytes of NVMe storage. So those are the main things with this PC. And going over virtual machines, so I'm not super experienced with working with them. I have been messing with them a little bit lately for some projects at work. So virtual machines and virtualization is basically the concept of having one physical computer with other computers inside of it. So for our setup here, we're going to have a host system, which is my gaming and editing rig. And inside of it, we're going to run a software called VirtualBox. And from in VirtualBox, we can make more virtual machines. And basically, we are going to allocate certain resources from our physical box to run our virtual machine. So we can allocate resources like CPU cores, the amount of RAM, and the amount of storage we want to give our virtual machine. So breaking this system down and the virtualization we're going to be doing is we have our host system, which is the computer I just mentioned. And this is what we consider a type 2 virtual machine setup. So we have a host system with a host operating system, in this case Windows 10. From that, we're going to run virtualization software, which in this case is going to be the Oracle VirtualBox. From VirtualBox, we are going to run our virtual machines off of. So those are going to be our guest OSs. A type 1 virtual machine setup basically eliminates the host operating system aspect of it. So if we were to run a type 1, we would just have a virtualization operating system or software instead of having Windows 10 with the virtualization software installed on top of it. So I'm sure there's pros and cons to each of them, but that's the basic rundown and the differences between type 1 and type 2. So why would anybody want to run a virtual machine in the first place? Well, this is more used for enterprise situations. Like I mentioned, the convenience of virtual machines and having them inside of one system is really nice, especially in an enterprise environment where you might have machines running different applications in a business or something like that, which is what I've been messing with a little bit lately. Other reasons maybe you want to learn Linux or learn a little bit of ethical hacking, stuff like that. Virtual machines are absolutely prime for stuff like this because when you install a software like VirtualBox and build your machines out inside of it, you won't affect your host operating system, which is key. And that's how a lot of people do different types of hacking and ethical hacking, is they learn it through virtual machines. So if they accidentally program something that corrupts the system, it's just a virtual machine, so they can delete that system and start over. But for our particular use case today and installing a virtual machine on our system for retro gaming, this is more of my personal preference. I really don't like any sort of emulation through Windows. I prefer installing everything on a Linux-based system. That's why a lot of times I'll use Raspberry Pis and stuff like that. But in this case, I really want it in this setup, so we're just going to install a virtual machine and install different types of retro gaming emulators and software, and just run it through a virtual machine. So I don't know how it's going to perform, but we're going to try to utilize some of our core systems hardware, such as the RAM, CPU cores, and storage, and see how it does. So with all that out of the way, guys, we're going to jump onto the desktop, install VirtualBox, get our first virtual machine set up, and install a operating system on it, and then we'll start installing some of our software in the virtual machine for retro gaming and emulation. So let's get right to it. Okay guys, so here we are on my desktop, and I got some applications opened up, as you can see, but I already have VirtualBox pre-installed, or not installed, but I have it downloaded already. If I go into my downloads folder, we do have VirtualBox right here, so we're going to run through the wizard and get it installed. I'll have the links in the description for where you guys can install this. Now you can install VirtualBox on a Windows machine, a Mac OS machine, and a Linux machine. So you're pretty open to any operating systems to install it on. So it's going to run us through a setup wizard. So I'm going to click next. And this is some of the stuff that VirtualBox is going to install. So we have the application, VirtualBox USB support, networking, virtual bridge. Okay, so we'll just leave that as default. Location, I'm actually going to move. I don't really want it on my C drive, so we're going to see if we can move it. Instead, I have another NVMe SSD that I mostly use for games, so in that case I'm going to install VirtualBox on that one if possible. Okay guys, so here we are. This is off of the setup menu. So the default location is Program Files, Oracle VirtualBox. I'm going to move that to my secondary drive. I don't want it on my operating system drive for my host system. So I'm going to move it to a different location. I'm actually going to move it to my D drive. And I already have a folder made called VirtualBox. So I'm going to put it right in here. That looks good. I'm going to click next. It gives us some options for start menu entries, shortcut. We'll just leave that all as default. Network interfaces. Okay, so this is just warning you that it'll temporarily disconnect you from your network possibly. So we're gonna go ahead and install it now. Okay guys, so this is the VirtualBox main menu. Now it's pretty simple, the overall setup and display. I have seen it to where I was like watching tutorials and it looks a little bit different depending on the version, but it's just a lot of stuff is just moved around. So okay guys, now that you have VirtualBox installed, before we go any further and start configuring our virtual machine, you're going to want to have a operating system already downloaded. So like if you go online and grab Ubuntu server or Ubuntu desktop, you just want an operating system that you already have the ISO file for, or it could be Windows 10 even, or whatever you guys want to use. In this case, I already do have Ubuntu server downloaded on this system, so I'm just going to use that and we're going to customize it from there. So we want to go to new. Here we go. This looks correct. So this is a little bit of a wizard to start creating our virtual machine. So in this case it says, alright, so we're just going to name this one VM1 underscore retro gaming. Cool, we'll do that. And then once again you want to select a machine folder. I don't want it on the C drive again, especially since I installed VirtualBox on my D drive. So we're going to go back to the D drive, click on VirtualBox, and these are all folders that VirtualBox installed. So I'm going to make a new one if it lets us. I'm going to name this one Custom VMs. I don't think it'll mess up the VirtualBox installation if we added this folder to it. At least I hope not, so we'll give it a try. I'm going to select that folder. And for the type, there's lots of different types in here. We have Linux, Microsoft, Mac OS, and some other OSs that you can install. So in our case, we're going to go Linux, we're going to go Ubuntu. So I was a little bit skeptical of this happening. We got an error, cannot create machine folder, VM1 Retro Gaming, and parent folder of VirtualBox / custom VMs. So I'm guessing it's a confliction between the VirtualBox installation and where we wanted to place our VM. So that's okay. I was kind of skeptical of that to start with. So we're going to go to other. We're going to select a different folder. I'm going to go back into my D drive, and instead of VirtualBox, I'm just gonna go VirtualBox underscore VMs. Now this shouldn't be a problem. Oops. Let's make that new folder. Select that. And this should fix up the errors we got. So that looks good. So both of our virtual, like I mentioned, we have VirtualBox installed on our D drive, and then we're also going to have the VMs in our D drive. So, and just make sure you're selecting folders that have the space for it. And as we can see on my PC, I still got quite a bit of space in my D drive. We got 317 gigs. So that looks good. Let's see if we get another error. Nope, it looks like it went through. So now it's asking for the amount of RAM we want to give our virtual machine. So this can vary depending on your system and what other applications you're going to run. This virtual machine isn't going to be running all the time. It's only going to run when we want to play some retro games. So I probably won't have too many other applications opened. But just to be sure, I'm going to start opening up things I might have open in the background. So in this case, it might be Xbox Console Companion if I'm online with my friends, or if I'm chatting on Steam. So we're going to kind of give this maybe worst case scenario and see how much RAM we're actually utilizing. And I'm just going to open up my task manager and see where we're at on memory consumption. So this is a good way to get a baseline of what you might have as far as memory utilization on your host system. And then you can see how much room and how much you can give your guest OS. As we can see, our CPU utilization is pretty low. It's only 8%, but we're more concerned about memory. And right now we're only using about 10 gigs of RAM. And like I mentioned, we're trying to create maybe a worst case scenario that's realistic. I'm not going to be running this VM while I'm editing videos and stuff like that. So I don't have to worry about that type of application being opened up. And I'm not going to be gaming on my host operating system and then have my VM opened up. So we don't have to worry about that either. So we can give it quite a bit. I'm going to give it around 8 gigs. And we do have 32 gigs on this system. So we have a pretty fair amount. That's a pretty generous amount. I'm going to close out some of this stuff. So now it's asking about the hard drive. So we're going to create a virtual hard disk now. So like we're making a virtual computer, we're also giving this computer virtual storage, which is going to be a small piece of storage from our physical storage. So we're going to create a virtual hard disk now. VDI, VHD, there's a couple different options. I'm going to leave it as default. And we're going to do default again. So right now, by default, it has, and you can see the path where it's going, VirtualBox VMs. It makes it nice and organized. As you can see here, it goes in our VM1 Retro Gaming, which they made a folder for. And then here is going to be the folder for the storage inside of there. So I love the way it's organized. Right now it has it set to 10 gigs. I think I'm just going to give it like 20 gigs. I don't think we'll need much more than that. A lot of these retro gaming files are pretty small, and then our operating system doesn't take up that much room either. But I might up it to 32. Let's just do that, just to be safe. And I think this can be adjusted after too. I haven't tried messing with the storage, but I think there's an option for that. So there we go. We have a virtual machine created. Now this virtual machine, it hasn't installed the operating system yet. So if we start this machine, really nothing's going to happen. Yeah, so it doesn't have a startup disk. So it's just like if you were to try and boot up a PC without a boot drive. Nothing's going to happen. So one thing too I forgot to mention is VirtualBox does require an extension pack for some extra features. So that can also be downloaded from virtualbox.org. So we're going to go ahead and open that up. I already have it downloaded. So it's right here. And I'm going to click install. Agree. And it's going to start installing our extension pack. And just to be sure, I'm going to close out of VirtualBox and all that stuff and just restart the program. Cool. So now we're going to go into our settings, and there's obviously a lot of stuff you can mess with in here. I don't think there's a whole lot we have to, but I'm going to go down to System. You can see the amount of memory that we selected earlier, and our processors are still grayed out. Why? Okay guys, I just rebooted my system because there is one thing I forgot and didn't realize. So in order for you to be able to mess with the settings menu in VirtualBox and give your system, adjust the base memory and adjust the number of cores that you want to give your virtual machine, you have to have hardware virtualization enabled in your BIOS. And in our case, by default, it was disabled. So in many cases of your BIOS, it's usually going to be in the Advanced tab and sometimes in the CPU settings. And if you go in there, in my case it was advanced CPU settings, and it says Intel hardware virtualization, and it just had a box for enabled or disabled. Just switch that over to enabled and that will unlock these features for you. And in our case too, we did have a little error down here at the bottom, so, and that's gone, and it looks like we can adjust the number of CPU cores and threads that we give our system. So good deal. So now that we got that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and up the CPU cores a little bit. I'm just going to give us 4. That's probably more than enough. So from here we have a virtual machine, but it doesn't have an OS or anything on it. So when we click start, it's kind of like booting up a computer that doesn't have a boot drive on it. It's kind of like, all right, what are we doing? I don't know what to boot from. No bootable device found. Okay guys, we're back in our virtual machine, and I did get it to boot into our installation medium, which is Ubuntu server. I didn't get the pop-up window that normally happens. So basically, whenever you open up your virtual machine for the first time, it doesn't know what to boot to. So it gives you a window, a startup disk window, and you'll just select your ISO file that you want to use. In our case, we didn't get that window, so I had to go to optical drive, choose a disk file, and then select it from there, reboot the system, then it booted into Ubuntu. So now it's just like installing an OS on a actual physical computer. So make sure I'm selected. We're just gonna go through the installation of Ubuntu server. Alrighty guys, we are back, and I went ahead and installed the desktop environment for our Linux virtual machine. I went with KDE, got that all set up and made some customizations to it. I went through all of that stuff off camera just to ensure that this video wouldn't be an hour plus long. Talking a little bit about the desktop environment, KDE, I usually go with the GNOME desktop environment. I'm pretty familiar with it, and it has lots of features packed into it, but I wanted to try something a little bit different like KDE, where you have a little bit more options to customize the look and user experience of the desktop environment. On top of our virtual machine with the KDE desktop environment, for emulation we installed RetroPie, and I did install Desmu for a DS emulator. First, going over RetroPie, this emulation software is probably one of my favorites. I've ran it as a host operating system on Raspberry Pis in the past and have had great luck with it. And I've also run it on other Linux-based systems, mainly Ubuntu, and it's done really well. As far as the gaming experience of running RetroPie inside of a virtual machine, it did pretty well overall. Most of the retro games I tested were pretty lightweight, and they were from Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, and a game for Sega Mega Drive. The games for these systems ran really well, and I believe we hit all of the native frame rates that the games were manufactured to hit. I tried to run some Nintendo 64 games, but unfortunately, anytime I would select one and try to load it, I could hear the audio coming from the game, but it didn't actually give me a display. Lastly, through RetroPie, I did run a Sega Mega Drive game, Sonic 3 in particular, and this game ran extremely well for a fast-paced side-scroller. Overall, emulation on RetroPie was a pretty good experience on our Linux virtual machine, aside from the fact that we weren't able to run a N64 title, which this also could have been issues with the ROMs that I use, so I'll be sure to test some more titles from N64 on our virtual machine in the future. Lastly, talking about Desmu Me a little bit, I really love some of the Nintendo DS titles, so I really wanted to run an emulator for Nintendo DS on this virtual machine, which we only have a couple options, and one of the most popular ones is Desmu Me, which we installed on the system. Another option that unfortunately doesn't work on Ubuntu OS systems is an experimental package inside of RetroPie, which allows you to run a Nintendo DS emulator. That one's called Drastic, which, like I mentioned, it is an experimental package. Unfortunately, it only runs on a Raspberry Pi that has RetroPie installed as the host operating system. As far as my experience with Desmu Me, I've had really good luck with it on a Windows-based machine, and the interface is much better, but unfortunately, installing it on a Linux-based system, I can't get past the controller setup inside the Desmu Me, and unfortunately it kept crashing my system. So I'm not sure if it's just the virtual machine that doesn't interact too well with the emulator, or if it's just that Desmu Me is pretty poor on Linux. So for something like this, I might just stick with running it in Windows or try it on a standalone Linux-based system. So all in all, guys, I would say it is definitely doable to run a virtual machine that is designated for retro gaming, and there's a bunch of ways you can skin it. In our case, we actually just ran a Ubuntu based system as a virtual machine and created our desktop environment and installed all the applications on top of that. This is a good way to go if you want to do other things outside of retro gaming. It gives you a wide variety because you have the whole operating system at your fingertips. You could also go another route by installing a retro gaming specific OS, like RetroPie's operating system install, Batocera, and there's a bunch of other ones out there. This would probably be a really good way to go if you are just looking to run older retro consoles and you don't plan on trying to run some newer consoles like a Nintendo DS emulator or like a PSP emulator, stuff that's a little bit newer where it's not necessarily integrated inside of a retro gaming OS. But that's going to wrap up this video, guys. Thank you for watching. If you guys enjoyed the video and learned something, make sure to drop a like on it and let me know in the comments if you want to see more Linux oriented tutorials / projects. Thanks a bunch for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.